The dog wouldn't let anyone near the car. When the police finally looked inside, they cried. Rain poured from the sky in relentless sheets, hammering rooftops and spilling down windows in icy torrents. The quiet suburb, usually peaceful at this hour, had transformed into a scene of chaos as water surged along the curbs, turning the streets into rushing streams. Distant thunder rolled across the sky, each low rumble punctuated by sharp flashes of lightning that momentarily illuminated the drenched landscape. The darkness felt alive, pressing in on the neighborhood, where people huddled inside their homes, listening to the storm's unrelenting fury. Amid the storm's cacophony, another sound cut through the night, a desperate plea. Mick's bark was deep and commanding, each sharp note echoing off the rain-slick pavement. The large dog circled a rusted sedan parked at the edge of the street, his soaked black fur clinging to his lean frame. His bark wasn't random, it carried a frantic urgency that demanded attention, rising above the drumming rain and distant thunder. With every pass around the battered car, Mick's eyes darted toward the surrounding houses, his body trembling as if the storm wasn't the only weight pressing down on him. The neighbors began to take notice. At first, cautious faces peered out from behind fogged windows, shadows hesitating at their doors. Slowly, a few ventured out into the storm, shielding themselves with umbrellas or pulling their coats tightly around them. One by one, they gathered in small clusters, their hushed murmurs nearly lost beneath the rain's roar. They squinted toward Mick, the dark outline of his body illuminated sporadically by flashes of lightning. His movements were erratic but deliberate, his barking relentless despite the downpour. "What's that dog going on about?" a voice called from a nearby porch, thick with suspicion. Jacob was the first to step forward, a lean figure with sharp features and a wary posture, the kind that belonged to someone who had seen trouble before. His military jacket, faded and frayed at the edges, clung to him as he moved toward the car, gripping a flashlight. The beam cut through the rain, catching the glint of Mick's wide, wild eyes. The dog's focus snapped to Jacob, his barking shifting into a low, rumbling growl. "Easy, boy," Jacob muttered, though his grip on the flashlight tightened. He could feel the tension radiating from the animal, an invisible wall of protectiveness that stopped him in his tracks. Slowly, he swept the flashlight across the car's fogged windows and dented frame, unease settling deep in his gut. The sedan had been parked there for weeks, neglected and rusting under the elements. Tonight, though, something felt different, charged, almost menacing.
A younger man stepped out of the crowd, holding a stick in one hand, his posture tense and aggressive. "I'll scare him off," he said, his voice carrying a mix of bravado and irritation. He raised the stick, taking a deliberate step toward Mick. "Back off," Jacob shouted, his voice cutting through the rain. The young man hesitated, but his eyes remained locked on the dog. Mick didn't flinch. His growl deepened, a warning that resonated in the bones of anyone close enough to hear. His soaked body trembled, yet his stance was immovable, his ears pinned forward as if daring anyone to challenge him. "What's wrong with him?" someone else asked, their voice edged with nervousness. The question hung in the air, unanswered. Mick's defiance unsettled them all, an unspoken message in his every bark and growl. Some in the crowd began whispering about calling animal control, their unease growing with every passing moment. Others urged the young man to test the dog's resolve, but Mick's intense gaze held them fast, a silent promise of resistance that no one was eager to test. Then, a voice rose from the group, calm but firm. "Stop this nonsense," Mrs. Marta called, her words carrying a weight that only years of wisdom could lend. Wrapped in an old raincoat, the elderly widow stepped forward, her frail form unshaken by the storm. She had lived on this street longer than most, her presence a familiar comfort to those who knew her. Her eyes sharp and knowing, fixed on Mick with an understanding that made the others fall silent. "He's not barking for no reason," she said, her voice softer now as she moved closer. She raised a hand toward Mick, her movements slow and deliberate. "This dog's trying to tell us something. Look at him. He's soaked, trembling, and bleeding. This isn't about scaring anyone off. The crowd shifted uneasily, their gazes moving from Mrs. Marta to the dog. For the first time, they noticed the dark streak of blood matting Mick's fur near his head, the way his sides heaved with every breath. Yet his focus never wavered, his growl softening only slightly as Mrs. Marta drew nearer. The metallic scent in the air, faint but sharp, reached her nose as she stopped a few feet away from the car. Her eyes flicked to the sedan's locked doors and fogged windows, her brow furrowing. Something about the scene didn't sit right. "Mick," she called gently, her voice barely rising above the rain. The dog's ears twitched, his gaze flicking toward her for the briefest moment before returning to the car. "You're protecting something, aren't you?" Mrs. Marta straightened, her expression firm as she turned to the crowd. "We need the police. This isn't something for us to handle." Reaching into her coat pocket, she pulled out a phone with trembling hands. The crowd, previously restless and murmuring, stilled as she dialed. The rain continued its relentless assault, but the tension among them had shifted. They were no longer spectators. They were witnesses to something they didn't yet understand. Mick's bark softened into a low whine as Mrs. Marta spoke calmly into the phone. Her eyes remained on the dog, a silent connection forming between them as if she could see the weight of his determination. "Yes, Officer Clark," she said, her voice steady despite the storm. "You need to come quickly. There's something in the car, and a dog that won't let us near." As she ended the call, the crowd began to disperse slightly, retreating under porches and umbrellas. But Mrs. Marta stayed put, her eyes never leaving Mick. The dog stood firm, his growl rising and falling in rhythm with the rain, as if counting down the seconds until help arrived. And when the distant sound of sirens pierced the night, Mick's bark surged again, a clarion call cutting through the storm, echoing with the urgency of a message no one yet understood. The wail of sirens cut through the downpour as a patrol car rounded the corner, its flashing lights casting distorted patterns on the rain-soaked streets. The crowd stirred but didn't disperse, their eyes fixed on the approaching vehicle. Mick's barking grew sharper, louder, as if urging the officers to hurry. The dog's drenched frame remained rooted to the spot, his growls unwavering as water streamed down his trembling body. His posture spoke of defiance and desperation, a silent declaration that no one would pass him until the right hands arrived. The patrol car came to a stop a short distance from the sedan. The two officers stepped out, their movements brisk but measured. Leading the way was Clark Harris, a tall, broad-shouldered man whose calm demeanor hinted at years of experience. His eyes scanned the scene, taking in the frightened crowd, the battered car, and finally, the soaked and bleeding dog that stood like a sentry before it. Mick's growl deepened as Clark approached, his dark eyes glinting with a mix of warning and plea. "Stay back," one of the neighbors whispered. "That dog's been barking his head off all night. Won't let anyone near." Clark raised a hand, signaling for silence. He studied Mick carefully, noting the tension in the dog's stance and the way his eyes darted between the car and the officer. It wasn't aggression he saw. It was fear, mixed with something fierce and unyielding. He crouched slightly, making himself smaller, and spoke in a low, steady voice. "Easy, boy," he murmured, his tone soothing. "We're here to help. Whatever it is you're protecting, we're going to take care of it." Mick's growls faltered for a moment, his ears twitching as if weighing Clark's intent. The officer took a cautious step forward, his hands open and unthreatening. "That's it," he said gently. "We're on the same side here." The dog's eyes flicked to the car, his body tense but no longer rigid with hostility. It was a gesture so subtle that most of the onlookers missed it, but Clark saw it clearly. Mick was giving him permission, though the trust came with conditions. Clark nodded to himself, understanding the gravity of what he was about to do. He turned to his partner, a younger officer named Diaz, and spoke quietly. "Hang back. Let me handle this." Diaz hesitated but complied, keeping his distance as Clark moved closer. Mick's growl rose again, a low rumble that vibrated in his chest, but he didn't lunge. His muscles quivered with exertion, his head lowering slightly as he stepped aside just enough for Clark to reach the car door. The officer placed a hand on the handle, glancing at Mick one last time. The dog's gaze was fixed on him, intense and unyielding, as if urging him to move faster. Clark braced himself, pulling the door open with deliberate care. The interior of the car was dim and damp, the windows fogged from the cold rain outside. At first, Clark's eyes struggled to make sense of what he was seeing. Then, as his flashlight swept across the back seat, his breath caught in his throat. A baby, tiny and pale, swaddled in a threadbare blanket that did little to shield it from the cold. The child's stillness was unnerving, its face so eerily white that, for a heart-stopping moment, Clark feared the worst. He reached in carefully, his hands steady but his heart pounding. As he lifted the baby, the fragile form felt weightless, unnervingly light. A faint warmth clung to the small body, but the child's breaths were so shallow they were barely perceptible. "Diaz, get on the radio," Clark barked, his voice tight with urgency. "Call for an ambulance. Now." Diaz sprang into action, his voice urgent as he relayed the situation to dispatch. The neighbors, once hushed with uncertainty, erupted into murmurs of shock and disbelief. Some clutched their coats tighter, while others exchanged looks of horror, their faces pale in the flashing blue and red lights. Mick let out a low whine, stepping closer to Clark as the officer cradled the baby in his arms. The dog's movements were slow, almost hesitant, as if afraid of harming the fragile life he had been protecting. His gaze never left the child, his nose twitching as he sniffed the blanket. He let out a soft, pitiful sound, one that broke through Clark's professional composure and settled deep in his chest. "You've done your part," Clark said softly, his voice carrying a note of something close to reverence. "We'll take it from here." But Mick wasn't about to leave. As Clark moved toward the patrol car, the dog limped after him, each step heavy with exhaustion but resolute. Diaz opened the back door, and Mick climbed in without hesitation, his eyes fixed on the baby as if refusing to be separated. Clark exchanged a glance with his partner, who nodded in silent agreement. The dog would stay. When they arrived at the hospital, the scene erupted into controlled chaos. Nurses and doctors rushed forward, their hands steady and sure as they took the baby from Clark's arms. Mick followed closely, his growls replaced by soft whimpers as he paced near the gurney. The medical staff hesitated at first, their eyes darting nervously to the large, bedraggled dog, but one glance at his pleading eyes silenced their objections. Clark intervened, his voice calm but firm. "Let him stay. He's been protecting that baby all night. He won't get in the way." Reluctantly, they allowed Mick to sit near the corner of the room as they worked. The child was hooked up to monitors, the faint beeping of the heart rate machine a welcome sound in the tense atmosphere. Mick lay down, his head resting on his paws, his eyes never leaving the baby. Nurses whispered among themselves, stealing glances at the dog, marveling at his devotion. Clark stayed nearby, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. His gaze alternated between the medical staff and Mick, his mind replaying the night's events. He couldn't shake the image of the dog standing guard in the rain, refusing to back down despite the cold, the wet, and the blood dripping from his own head. It wasn't just loyalty, it was something deeper, something sacred. One of the nurses knelt beside Mick, her hand tentative as she reached out to stroke his matted fur. The dog didn't flinch, his body too exhausted to protest. He closed his eyes briefly, a momentary surrender to the comfort being offered. "You're a good boy," the nurse murmured, her voice soft. Mick's tail thumped weakly against the floor in response. The hours dragged on, the storm outside finally giving way to the faint light of dawn. The baby's condition stabilized, his pale cheeks taking on a faint flush of color. Mick remained by his side, his presence a quiet reassurance to everyone who passed through the room. Clark finally allowed himself to exhale, the weight in his chest easing slightly. He stepped closer to the bed, resting a hand on Mick's head. The dog looked up at him, his eyes tired but steady, as if asking for permission to rest. "You've done enough, buddy," Clark said softly. "We've got him now. You can sleep." Mick let out a long breath, his eyes fluttering shut as he curled up beside the bed. His loyalty had carried him through the storm, through the blood and exhaustion. And now, in this small, sterile room, he allowed himself to finally let go. The hospital room was quiet except for the soft hum of machines and the rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor. Pale morning light filtered through the half-drawn blinds, casting muted patterns on the walls. Linda lay motionless on the bed, her skin ashen against the crisp white of the hospital sheets. Her breaths were shallow, each one labored as though drawn from a well that had nearly run dry. Tubes snaked from her fragile body, connecting her to monitors and for drips. Her hair, damp and clinging to her temples, framed a face etched with exhaustion and pain. Mick sat at the foot of the bed, his body still except for the occasional flick of his tail. His dark eyes, sharp and unwavering, were fixed on Linda. He hadn't left her side since the doctors had wheeled her into the room. Occasionally, his nose twitched as he caught her faint scent, and his ears perked at the slightest sound. For hours he waited, his patience as steady as his loyalty. Nurses passing by whispered about the strange sight of the dog, a guardian as silent and determined as any human protector. As the day stretched on, Linda stirred, her eyelids fluttered, her brow furrowing as she slowly emerged from the haze of unconsciousness. Mick lifted his head, his ears tilting forward in anticipation. A soft whimper escaped his throat, a sound so gentle and hopeful it seemed to fill the sterile room with warmth. Linda's eyes opened, unfocused at first, but they soon found the familiar figure of Mick. Her lips trembled into a faint, tired smile. "Mick?" she murmured, her voice hoarse and barely audible. It was a single word, but it carried the weight of gratitude, relief, and the deep bond they shared. Mick let out a soft huff, leaning forward to nudge her hand with his nose. Linda's fingers moved weakly, brushing against his damp fur. The touch seemed to steady her, anchoring her in the moment. She took a shaky breath, her eyes darting around the room as she tried to piece together where she was and how she'd gotten there. Clark, who had been standing quietly by the doorway, stepped forward. His gaze was steady but compassionate as he spoke. "Linda Moreno?" She turned her head slowly toward him, her expression wary but too weak to convey much else. Her eyes flicked to Mick, then back to Clark. "The baby?" she whispered, panic flashing across her features. "My son. Where is he?" "He's safe," Clark assured her, his tone firm but kind. "We found him in the car last night. He's being taken care of. Thanks to Mick, he's going to be okay." Linda's entire body seemed to deflate, her relief palpable. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling over and tracing silent paths down her cheeks. She closed her eyes for a moment, her lips moving in what might have been a prayer or a thank you. When she opened them again, her gaze returned to Mick, who remained watchful, his eyes never leaving her face. Clark pulled a chair closer to the bed and sat down. "Can you tell me what happened?" he asked gently. "How you ended up out there? How the baby ended up in the car?" Linda's gaze drifted to the ceiling, her eyes glassy as though she were looking at a distant memory. Her fingers trembled as she brushed a strand of hair from her face. "It started months ago," she began, her voice faint but growing steadier with each word. "Back when things were still normal." Her words came in fits and starts, broken by long pauses as she struggled to collect herself. She spoke of her boyfriend, Darren, who had once seemed like her world. "He was charming," she said, her lips curling into a bitter smile. "The kind of guy who made you feel like you were the only person in the room. I thought he loved me." Her voice faltered, and Mick nudged her hand again, as if urging her to continue. She drew a shaky breath and pressed on. "When I found out I was pregnant, I thought it would bring us closer, that he'd be happy. But he wasn't. He was angry, furious, said he wasn't ready for that kind of responsibility, that it wasn't part of his plans. Her voice broke, and a fresh wave of tears spilled down her cheeks. Clark remained silent, letting her speak at her own pace. "He told me I had to fix it," she said, her voice trembling with shame and anger. "But I couldn't do it. I couldn't give up my baby. So he threw me out, just like that. No money, no place to go. Just me, my baby, and Mick." Her hand moved instinctively toward her stomach, as though remembering the weight of her pregnancy. "I had nowhere to go," she continued. "I tried shelters, but they were full, or they didn't allow dogs. Couldn't leave Mick behind. He's all I had. He's all we had." She recounted the weeks that followed, of nights spent on park benches, of cold mornings where she woke to the sound of Mick growling at strangers who came too close. "He protected us," she said, her voice soft. "Even when I couldn't, he stood watch every night, made sure I was safe, made sure my baby was safe." Her voice grew quieter as she spoke of the storm. "I found that car 2 nights ago. It was just sitting there, abandoned. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. Mick and I stayed with the baby in the back seat. I thought we could make it through the night." She paused, her breath hitching as fresh tears welled up. "But the baby was hungry, crying. I didn't have anything left to give him. I had to find help. I told Mick to stay with the baby and keep him safe. I thought I'd be back before they even knew I was gone." Her voice broke entirely, and she covered her face with her hands. "But I didn't make it. Collapsed. I don't even remember how I got here." Clark leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "You did everything you could," he said gently. "More than most people would have. And because of you and Mick, your baby is alive. He's safe." Linda shook her head, her hands falling to her sides. "I failed him," she whispered. "I left him in that car." "No," Clark said firmly, his voice carrying a quiet authority. "You trusted Mick, and Mick didn't let you down." Linda's gaze shifted to the dog, who was still watching her with those steady, soulful eyes. She reached out to him, her fingers trembling as she stroked his damp fur. Nick leaned into her touch, his tail thumping softly against the floor. For a long moment, the room was silent except for the steady beeping of the monitors. Linda closed her eyes, her breathing evening out as she rested her hand on Mick's head. The weight of her story hung heavy in the air, but so did the quiet strength of the bond between her and her dog. Clark stood, his gaze lingering on the pair. "Get some rest," he said quietly. "Your baby's in good hands, and so are you." As he stepped out of the room, he couldn't help but glance back. Mick had curled up beside the bed, his head resting on Linda's hand. It was a scene that spoke of a loyalty so profound it didn't need words, a testament to the strength of the bond between them. The soft, steady hum of machines filled the hospital room as Linda lay on the bed, her breaths growing more shallow with each passing hour. The morning light spilling through the blinds seemed softer, almost reverent, as if it knew these moments were fragile. Mick sat curled up at her side, his head resting lightly on the blanket near her hand. Every so often, his ears twitched, and he let out a low whimper, sensing the quiet struggle taking place within her frail body. Clark stood at the foot of the bed, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression unreadable but his eyes heavy with the weight of unspoken emotions. He had spent hours in this room, listening to Linda's whispered memories, her fleeting smiles when she spoke of her son, and the gratitude in her voice when she spoke of Mick. Now her voice was almost gone, her strength a flickering flame that threatened to be extinguished. But there was something she still needed to say. "Clark," she murmured, her voice so faint it barely carried across the room. He stepped closer, pulling a chair to her bedside and sitting down. Linda's hand moved weakly, and he reached out, taking it in his own. Her fingers were cold, trembling slightly as they closed around his. "Promise me," she whispered, her eyes searching his face. "Promise me you'll take care of him, my boy, and Nick." Her words were heavy, laden with a lifetime of love and sacrifice. Clark nodded, his grip firm but gentle. "I promise," he said, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "They'll be safe. I'll make sure of it." A faint smile touched Linda's lips, her expression softening as her eyes drifted toward Mick. The dog raised his head, his gaze meeting hers with an intensity that spoke volumes. "You've been my guardian angel," she said. Her words meant for Mick but audible enough for Clark to hear. "I never could have done this without you." Mick let out a soft huff, his tail thumping weakly against the bed. He closed briefly, her chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. When she opened them again, her gaze lingered on Mick, then shifted to Clark, who sat silently at her side. She gave his hand the faintest squeeze, her grip weak but full of meaning. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice nearly inaudible. "For everything." Clark nodded, his throat too tight to respond. He watched as Linda's eyes began to close, her features softening as the tension in her body ebbed away. Mick let out a low, mournful whine, his head lowering to rest against her arm. The monitors beside the bed beat steadily, a rhythm that slowed until it stopped altogether, the room falling into a deep, solemn quiet. Clark sat there for a long moment, holding her hand as the finality of her passing settled over him. His promise to Linda echoed in his mind, a vow he felt in every fiber of his being. Mick stayed motionless, his presence a silent acknowledgement of the life that had just slipped away. Eventually, Clark stood, releasing her hand gently. He placed a comforting hand on Mick's head, his fingers running through the dog's matted fur. "Come on, buddy," he said softly. "We've got to take care of her boy now." Mick hesitated, his body reluctant to leave Linda's side. But as Clark moved toward the door, the dog followed, his steps slow and deliberate, as if each one was an act of leaving behind a part of himself. The days that followed were a whirlwind of paperwork and planning. Clark and his wife, Hannah, had already begun discussing adoption, but now it was a certainty. Linda's baby, now officially named Tommy, was placed in their care. The process moved quickly, thanks to Clark's position in the community and the urgency of the situation. When Tommy was brought home for the first time, the house felt different, as though it had been waiting for him all along. Hannah greeted the baby with tears in her eyes, cradling him with a tenderness that immediately filled the room with warmth. Nick, ever the protector, stayed close, his dark eyes watching every move as though ensuring Tommy's safety. "You're safe now," Hannah whispered to the baby, her voice thick with emotion. "You've got a family who loves you." Clark stood nearby, his arms crossed, a quiet smile playing at his lips. "And a dog who won't let you out of his sight," he added, glancing down at Mick. The dog's loyalty to Tommy was evident from the start. Mick followed the baby wherever he went. Whether it was a nap in the nursery, playtime in the living room, or feedings in the kitchen, Nick was never far. He had appointed himself the boy's guardian, and it was a role he took seriously. As Tommy grew, the family settled into a rhythm. Nights were filled with laughter and the soft babble of a growing child, while days brought walks in the park with Mick trotting proudly beside the stroller. The neighbors, who had once watched the events of that stormy night with skepticism and unease, began to embrace the family. Mrs. Marta was the first to visit, bringing a hand-knit blanket for Tommy. "For the little one," she said, her eyes misty as she handed it to Hannah. "He's got a strong guardian angel watching over him, you know?" Others followed, offering small tokens of support and kindness. Casserole here, a toy there. It was as if the neighborhood had taken Tommy and Mick under its wing, recognizing the extraordinary story that had brought them together. Clark found himself thinking of Linda often. In quiet moments, when the house was still and the world outside seemed far away, he would sit in Tommy's room, watching the boys sleep. Nick would lie at the foot of the crib, his watchful eyes always alert. Clark would sometimes whisper softly, telling Tommy stories of his mother. He spoke of her bravery, her love, and the sacrifices she had made to give him a chance at life. "She loved you more than anything," Clark would say, his voice low and steady. And Mick here, he's part of that love. He's going to look out for you, just like she did. As Tommy grew older, he began to understand the depth of the bond he shared with Mick. The dog was more than a pet. He was a piece of his mother's legacy, a bridge to a woman he would never truly know but would always carry in his heart. Mick's devotion never wavered, and as Tommy took his first steps, spoke his first words, and played in the backyard, the dog was always by his side. One summer evening, Clark and Hannah sat on the porch, watching Tommy chase fireflies in the yard. Mick followed close behind, his tail wagging as he kept pace with the boys' laughter. The sky was painted in hues of orange and pink, and a gentle breeze rustled the trees. "Hard to believe how far we've come," Clark said, his voice thoughtful. Hannah reached for his hand, her fingers lacing through his. "It's amazing, isn't it?" she replied. "How love can grow from the hardest places." Clark nodded, his gaze drifting to Mick. "That dog, he's something else. I've never seen loyalty like his. It's like he knows he has a purpose here." "He does," Hannah said, her smile soft. "He's a reminder of Linda, of everything she gave so that Tommy could have a chance." The years passed, and the bond between Tommy and Mick only deepened. By the time Tommy was old enough to attend school, Mick had become a legend in the neighborhood, a symbol of resilience, loyalty, and love. Neighbors still spoke of that stormy night when Mick had stood guard in the rain, protecting a fragile life.
They admired his devotion, and in many ways, they saw him as the heart of the family. Tommy grew into a bright and kind-hearted boy, his spirit shaped by the love and lessons of those who had cared for him. He never forgot the stories Clark had told him about his mother or the role Mick had played in saving his life. And while he carried Linda's memory in his heart, he also knew that his family, the one who had taken him in, loved him, and made him their own, was a gift he would always cherish. One evening, as Tommy sat on the porch with Mick by his side, he turned to the dog, his young voice full of conviction. "You're the best friend anyone could ever have, Mick," he said, wrapping his arms around the dog's neck. Mick's tail wagged slowly, his eyes closing as he leaned into the boy's embrace. Inside, Clark and Hannah watched from the window, their hearts full. They had built a family out of loss and love, weaving together the threads of a story that had begun in the rain. Mick, ever the guardian, had been the thread that bound them all together, a quiet presence whose loyalty had shaped their lives in ways they could never fully express.